Welcome back. We now continue to run down the list of top underreported news stories of 2013 with the director of Project Censored, Mickey Huff. Okay, Mickey, we are at the top 5. Number 5, hate groups and anti-government groups on the rise across the United States. Who reported that? What are the details behind it? And define the terms, hate group, anti-government groups.
Well, these are terms that, this is a study that's done by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I know that some people react when we use a certain source. Some people say, well, don't you realize this source is so biased and so on. And, this is, again, back to our interest. What we're interested in is the facts. And if a group is reporting on something factually and they're defining the terms that they're using, and we can kind of get an understanding of what they're trying to get across, we think it's very significant, people should know about it, then that's really what puts it on our radar. The Southern Poverty Law Center has done a lot of good work when it comes to looking at domestic slavery and so on. And in this study, this was reported in Huffington Post and, of course, at the Southern Poverty Law Center website. They're talking about a rise in anti-government groups, and they also call hate groups. Other terms that are used are patriot groups. And many of these, the quote unquote, many of the anti-government groups and patriot groups are more specifically ideologically libertarian. And I think that is
it fair though to call these groups that may be ideologically libertarian anti-government? For example, Sheriff Richard Mack, he's been a frequent guest on this program. Stuart Rhodes has joined us here, and they've shared their perspectives and activities that their groups are doing. And from what I can gather, based on what they're doing, they're simply pushing back on the countless laws that are limiting freedom in America. And those two individuals, Rhodes and Mack, have ended up on Southern Poverty Law Center's watch list and been labeled as anti-government groups. Is it fair for people that have an opinion to be labeled by that organization as such?
Well, free speech allows us to label each other however we want. How useful those labels are is an entirely different question. And I would suggest that simply because one is suspicious of the government, that shouldn't in and of itself make one a hate kind of group. Again, at Project Censored, I think that what you can look at is when you look at some hate kind of groups. Let me use the language specifically from the Southern Poverty Law Center study. They literally said, when they were talking about patriot groups or these so-called government groups, they say that by the Southern Poverty Law Center standards, hate groups, quote, have beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, typically for their immutable characteristics. Then the end of the quote, and their activities can include criminal acts, marches, rallies, speeches, meetings, leafleting, publishing, etc. I think that the type of study specifically, I don't think that writing, reports and books and having political opinions that rail against government encroachment are necessarily those targeted here. I think what we're seeing targeted more are the rallies where people are hanging nooses in trees, or people in the Republican Party like Clint Eastwood talking to an empty chair and attributing all these things in a chair, and then somebody hanging a chair in their tree. As an allusion to historical lynching.
I don't want to dwell on the topic too much, but I'm not an advocate for hate groups in any stretch, but isn't that their right to have those opinions and display effigies as such to provide their perspective?
As odious as it is under the First Amendment, one would argue that it is to a degree, and the courts have oft weighed in on what those degrees are, and the lines shift from generation to generation, and from ruling to ruling. Just as an aside, based on this same subject, I support a group called FIRE, and it's the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. They're a very pro-academic freedom organization, and like the ACLU, they have protected various groups that have said very unpopular things because they believe they have the right to say it. But I think what the Southern Poverty Law Center is getting at here, and why this story was interesting for us, is that there has been a proliferation of anti-government type rallies, and many of them have had some violent rhetoric. And I think that does concern some people about the public nature of protests. I mean, during the Bush years, there were many, many, many protests, but they were different types of protests. And I would argue that if the same types of groups and libertarian groups have a problem with an encroaching government under the Obama years, I really hope that those people were just as loud about their criticisms in the Bush years, because they really should have been, from the Patriot Act to the Military Commissions Act and so forth. So I'd like to see more continuity along those lines. And I'd also like maybe something for the Southern Poverty Law Center study to really help start a responsible discussion and debate about these issues and the nature of protest and the importance of dissent in our society, versus focusing on some of the more extreme cases where they don't necessarily focus on rights as much as they focus on identity politics.
All right, moving on to number 4, talks about whistleblowers. And clearly, whistleblowers have been all over the news. It's curious you would have it come in number 4. I'm curious, is it because it's talking about Obama's war on whistleblowers? I mean,
again, the stories are ranked by judges, and I think all the stories that end up in the book are very important. I think all the stories we research are very important, and you can see them on our website at projectcensored.org. You can even go there now and see the stories we're looking at for our next cycle. Your listeners and viewers can submit stories to us and give us feedback on them. We're a community-based organization and nonprofit with educational mission, so we welcome people for that. So aside from the rankings, I think this story is riveting. This was written about in Mother Jones, in The Guardian. This story really talks about how the Obama administration has gone after more whistleblowers than any president in history. Whether you look at the Chelsea Manning case, the Thomas Drake case, John Kiriakou. John Kiriakou, I have an interesting connection to the Kiriakou family. I grew up in the same town. I knew them. And John outed the CIA for waterboarding and torture. And it's another example of how the person that outs the crime goes to jail and does the time, like Chelsea Manning case or Thomas Drake in the NSA. There are numerous whistleblower cases that we looked at this year, and I'm sad to say there are many, many others. This year we're looking at even more whistleblower cases from Edward Snowden on up. Jeremy Hammond. This is a concerted effort.
On a side note regarding Snowden, do you think that amnesty will be granted to him if he stops leaking more information, as that has been recently discussed?
I don't know. The NSA is toying around with the idea. I know that, and there's a lot of other questions about Snowden and why he was allowed to basically disappear and other people weren't. And there's a whole host. We could have a whole show on that, I'm sure. But I think the most significant part of this, our Story 16, was a worldwide war on journalists, where we've seen a 50 and 60% increase in jailed journalists, killed journalists on the job, and so on. This story is more domestically in the United States about concerted efforts to silence people. Dianne Feinstein and the Free Flow of Information Act is part of this. And again, I think that we need to stand up and support whistleblowers. We need to support more transparency, not less. Obama said that, he was going to tell us all about the NSA anyway. Snowden just sort of expedited the process. Historically, that's nonsense. No president has ever just divulged information on their own because they felt like nice guys about it. These people had to be pushed to do it, forced to do it. Dan Ellsberg had to leak these documents in the Pentagon Papers. Chelsea Manning had to do it with WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, etc. We need more people like this. That's why our subtitle of our book this year is titled Fearless Speech in Fateful Times, and really goes back and looks at a history of what it means to have free speech. And Foucault gave this in one of his free speech lectures at UC Berkeley. And we talk about that in the beginning of our book with Andy Lee Roth. And that is that, free speech is fearless speech. It's speech that tells the truth based on the facts, regardless of consequences. And that's why whistleblowers should be held up as paragons of virtue in a free society.
Moving on to number 3. Trans-Pacific Partnership threatens a regime of corporate global governance. No doubt that's a mouthful, and very few people have heard about this Trans-Pacific Partnership. Explain.
I wish what you said was not true, but the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is something that's going on right now through the end part here of 2013. The Obama administration is really trying to push this through. And, really it's about corporations, transnational corporations trumping national sovereignty, having the right to have whatever labor practice they want, use markets the way they want, control the internet the way they want. And of course, we've seen many efforts to try to control the internet over the years, and net neutrality. And we're seeing that again now under the FCC. Tom Wheeler, again, a lot of media reformers thought that the Obama administration was going to usher in some real changes there. No, more of the same, more privatization, less freedom, less access. And the TPP is basically that. It's basically giving transnational corporations great power over nation states, great power over the public to make decisions that benefit themselves at the expense of the public interest. We think people should check it out. It's story number 3 in 2014. And again, your viewers can check that out online at projectcensored.org.
Coming in number 2, richest global 1% hide trillions of dollars in tax havens. How does that work?
Well, that works because these groups also lobby Congress, who write the laws and write the tax codes. And this is based on, data from the Bank of International Settlements, from the International Monetary Fund. Carl Herman wrote this story up for Washington's blog. Basically, because there are ways that wealthy individuals and corporations can hide money off the books, so to speak, we're talking about $10 trillion here that is held off the books. And if this money was taxable, it could generate over $280 billion. That's not quite a half of what the Pentagon gets a year, but that's an awful lot of money. And so if there were ways that and by the way, we're talking about the wealthiest people in the world that are hiding this money, right? So they don't have to pay taxes on it. They're already wealthy. So if they had to pay taxes on that money, they would still be extremely wealthy, and there would be more money put into the system to help offset inequality. Just like we talked about some of our other stories, number 6 and 14. We have another chapter in our book about this, in wealth and inequality and the global 1%. This is another example of how the rich get richer and the rest of us are stuck paying our taxes and footing the bill for public services.
All right, moving on to number 1, Bradley, or now he's known as Chelsea Manning, and the failure of corporate media. Quickly define corporate media for our viewers, and let's discuss this headline and the story behind it.
Corporate media is often referred to as mainstream media, but there's really not much mainstream about it. Corporate media is owned, meaning it is owned by major corporations, and they own leases to the airwaves. 6 major corporations own 90% of the news media in the United States, and they tend to control opinion and news reporting such that it benefits their bottom lines and the bottom lines of their shareholders, which they are required to do by their own corporate charters. So the First Amendment can often get trampled in the process. And speaking of trampling the First Amendment, our number 1 story this year is about shooting the messenger. The Chelsea Manning case went on in the military for some time. He was held in solitary confinement. He was treated in ways akin to under international law would be referred to as torture. And Manning trial got very little attention. Reader-supported news actually tried to gain access to it, even though there were passes that people could use to get access to cover the trial. They were not used and they were not being issued. One of the very few people that covered that story from beginning to end was an independent journalist named Kevin Gostola. Kevin's done great work. He does great work with Fire Dog Lake.
Kevin's been a guest on the program here as well.
Oh, right. Kevin does fabulous work. He continues to. Janet Reitman at Rolling Stone, Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian on this story as well. Manning is doing 35 years in prison for divulging the crimes of the United States in the Iraq War, essentially, through the only reason we know about these crimes are because Manning tried to release it to the major news media. They didn't want to cover these stories and sat on these stories. We learned just again that the New York Times was sitting on another story just in the last couple months that they knew about for years, just like they sat on the wiretapping case, AT&T and NSA in the Bush years. We know that these corporate media outlets are lapdogs, not watchdogs. They're gatekeepers of information. And the Manning documents with collateral murder and the WikiLeaks files show that. and Glenn Greenwald reporting on this and reporting on Snowden clearly show that. There is a wealth of information, a treasure trove of information that the people in the world have a right to know concerning what their governments are doing in their name and with their tax money, and the atrocities that are often conducted without any kind of oversight. And Manning, particularly, really raises the question as to, do we even have a free press? And how far will they go to prevent stories from being reported, right? And so we know that, since the 1950s and 60s, the CIA's Operation Mockingbird has worked with newsrooms. Every administration going back to at least Truman has worked with news media groups trying to suppress information and change information. The Obama administration is up the ante. They've gone after more whistleblowers than any administration combined.
You mentioned Operation Mockingbird.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned Operation Mockingbird. Could you define that a little bit deeper for the benefit of our viewers?
Yeah, Mockingbird is the CIA program that infiltrates newsrooms, and there were several thousand of these people through the 1960s. They were outed along with FBI COINTELPRO people during the Church Committee hearing. Senator Frank Church. We learned a lot about how the CIA really operates. And when we say corporate media, we're not naive at Project Censored. We know that corporations work with the military-industrial complex and work with various government agencies and so on. We know there's a symbiotic relationship between these, and we know the CIA works to control media.
When was Mockingbird finished?
Pardon me?
When did the Operation Mockingbird complete?
It is not. I mean, we still have collusion of the Central Intelligence Agency working in Hollywood, working on the script with Zero Dark 30, working with Argo. It comes in many guises. CNN got caught less than a decade ago with interns that were CIA assets. This is something that's still going on, where these are infiltrations into media, where these people actually write up the stories and they sort of get their angle out there. This isn't just something that happens through the State Department, through the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy, which is a fancy word for propaganda. It also happens here in these types of guises. And we've done a number of stories on this at Project Censored. And we've also cataloged how the Central Intelligence Agency hatched the term conspiracy theorist to discredit anyone that questioned official narratives of power. And here we have Manning clearly challenging the narratives of power. We're not winning hearts and minds. We're not liberating people in Iraq. We're committing war crimes.
Mickey,
right?
we certainly have to have you back to discuss, go deeper into the CIA infiltration of newsrooms across the country. But looking forward to 2014, what do you see on the horizon as far as news stories, the impact of the independent journalist rising across the country with the advent of modern technology?
Well, we have at our disposal, particularly in the United States, access to great technology, which is why we need to fight to keep net neutrality and keep the internet open. While you may see on the internet that there is a lot of quote unquote garbage or not factually substantiated information, it's still a great vehicle and tool for free speech and expression. And it's a place for independent journalists to publish and post materials that don't rely on, multi-million-dollar, infrastructures. Some of the great reporters and of course we have like Amy Goodman or Democracy Now! And they have a fairly decent budget these days and so on. But you also have groups like Project Censor that operate on a shoestring. You have Fire Dog Lake and Kevin Gosztola and these people that operate on shoestrings. Steve Horn, who writes a lot about fracking and the problems of fracking. I mean, there's some great reporters out there doing really amazing work. And at Project Censored, we really try to laud these people, the Lindsay Byersteins, the Marcy Wheelers. I mean, there's no shortage of just fantastic journalists and broadcasters out there doing work. Abby Martin at Russia Today's Breaking the Set. She works with us on our board. And, I think some of the key stories this year, some of the most important stories this year to follow are kind of follow-ups on last year. What is the state of the free press in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world? That's something we're paying very close attention to. Fukushima catastrophe. We have an air issue now where they're trying to remove rods, plutonium rods. Look, this could give us a nuclear winter. This could spell the end for people. We're still looking at problems with climate change and what's being covered or not covered. So we're still looking at a lot of the same kind of stories that we believe people have a right to know about, but the corporate media is just really dropping the ball. Nelson Mandela, how the corporate media ignored how the CIA helped put him in prison in 1962 in the first place, right? So we're still working on, adding the historical narrative, providing people with context, and most of all, we advocate media literacy and critical thinking so people can be independent thinkers, not just ideological thinkers, and don't just sort of knee-jerk react and repeat that which they hear in either the independent, alternative, or corporate media. We really champion independent thinkers. We have chapters in our book on critical thinking and media literacy. We've got information on our website, projectcensored.org. And our new movie, Project Censored, the movie Ending the Reign of Junk Food News, is a great way to introduce some of these problems to people that may not have been thinking about them before.
All right, Mickey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
That was the director of Project Censored, Mickey Huff. Stay tuned because we still have the rest of today's headlines, all of the news from Hollywood, California, and a full report on the weather right here on WHDT.